April 10th, 1834. A fire at Delphine LaLaurie's mansion would unveil horrors beyond imagination. One woman had jumped to her death, another was wrapped in intestines, and others were brutally tortured. These are some of the most disturbing discoveries inside famous serial killers' homes. 1890. Dr. Henry Howard Holmes opened the doors to his Grand Hotel in Chicago, a place he claimed was designed for comfort and luxury. But hidden behind its walls was a much darker purpose. Holmes had built a maze of death, where his victims would check in, but never check out. Holmes was a charming and well-educated man who presented himself as a successful entrepreneur. Prior to the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, a grand event celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, he built a massive 3-story hotel, later dubbed the Murder Castle. Designed with over 100 rooms and confusing hallways that led to dead ends, the building was a sinister playground for his dark desires. During the World's Fair, thousands flocked to Chicago, and many needed a place to stay. Holmes welcomed them into the hotel with a smile, but behind the hospitable facade, he lured guests, especially women, into rooms equipped with gas lines for asphyxiation, trapdoors, and sealed chambers. Many of the bodies ended up sliding down a hidden chute straight into the basement, where Holmes dissected and disposed of them. His killing spree lasted for 2 gruesome years. He capitalized on the influx of visitors, making it difficult for authorities to track the missing. Plus, his surgical skills allowed him to strip flesh from the bone, and then sell skeletons and organs to medical institutions and on the black market. And believe it or not, it wasn't actually murder that initially caught up with him, but fraud. After a series of failed financial schemes and an arrest for theft, investigators began to unravel the true extent of his crimes. When police searched his Chicago hotel, they uncovered a labyrinth of hidden passages, trapdoors, and soundproof rooms. And in the basement, they found a horrifying scene: a dissecting table, surgical tools, a crematorium, and vats of acid. The people in Chicago lost their minds over a cunning predator who took advantage of both his victims and the chaotic atmosphere of the World's Fair. Ultimately, Holmes confessed to 27 murders, though some say that he might have killed up to 200 people. May 7th, 1896, he was hanged for his crimes, but before that, he reflected on his nature by chillingly saying, "I was born with the devil in me. I couldn't help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing." April 1987. Police entered Gary Heidnik's Philadelphia home and uncovered a nightmare they couldn't have imagined. In his basement, Heidnik had imprisoned and tortured women for months, keeping them in a pit and subjecting them to unspeakable cruelty.
I was conscious enough to know that was a conscious act on my part, and that was essentially the reason.
Born in 1943, Gary Heidnik had always shown signs of a troubled mind. His early life was plagued by abuse and isolation. After being discharged from the army due to mental health conditions, he turned to religion to control people. He would become a self-proclaimed bishop of the United Church of the Ministers of God, presenting himself as a man of faith. His congregation of 50 members had no idea that under their feet, 6 women were chained, tortured, and abused for months. By 1986, he had started abducting women, all of whom were African American, keeping them locked in his basement. The way he captured his first victim, Josefina Rivera, was brutal. After luring her with the promise of money, he choked her, shackled her in chains, and threw her into a pit. Over time, Heidnik forced Rivera and other women to participate in torturing each other, using fear and manipulation to maintain control.
I was trying to find something that would make them behave.
But it was painful to them.
I hope so. That's what I was trying to achieve, to make them behave.
And so the basement became a chamber of horrors. Heidnik sexually assaulted and tortured the women regularly. With one victim, Sandra Lindsay, dying from starvation, he would dismember and cook parts of her body and allegedly mix it in with dog food, forcing the other women to eat it. This other woman, Deborah Dudley was killed after being electrocuted during one of Heidnik's twisted punishments. Fortunately, Rivera somehow managed to gain his trust, pretending to be on his side. She was able to convince him to let her go and visit her family, and instead, she obviously ran to the police. Heidnik was arrested that same day. But before that, what police discovered inside Gary's basement was a scene out of a horror movie. Several women found chained to pipes and confined in a dirt pit. The women had been starved, tortured, and subjected to unspeakable abuse. There were signs of electrical shocks used on them, and Heidnik had even kept one woman hanging by her wrists. 1988, Gary Heidnik was eventually convicted of 2 murders and sentenced to death. July 6, 1999, he was executed by lethal injection, leaving behind a legacy of unimaginable cruelty. Heidnik's crimes were so shocking that they inspired the character Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. But even more horrifying was the reality of how he manipulated not only his victims, but also those who followed him, showing just how far his control reached. August 8, 1973. Police were called to a Houston home by a panicked man named Elmer Wayne Henley. Inside, officers found the body of Dean Corll, the man who would later be called the Candyman Killer. To his neighbors, Dean Corll was the friendly guy who handed out candy, earning him that nickname because he worked at his mother's candy factory and seemed like an ordinary man. Now, behind this kind demeanor, Corll was a calculating serial killer. He lured boys to his house, often using candy, alcohol, or drugs, and with the help of 2 accomplices, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, he abducted, tortured, and murdered his victims. 1970, Corll began his killing spree, targeting vulnerable men around Houston. Many victims were tied to the torture board in his home, sexually assaulted, and then either strangled or shot. He would move frequently between apartments and houses to avoid suspicion, but each place had the same purpose: a setting for terror. Brooks and Henley helped him lure victims and participated in the crimes, sometimes for as little as $5. The killing spree came to an end when Henley, fearing for his own life, turned on Corll. After bringing 2 friends to Corll's home for what was supposed to be a party, Henley awoke to find himself tied up alongside him, with Corll threatening to kill them all. In a desperate move, Henley managed to convince Corll to untie him. Then he grabbed Corll's gun and shot him dead. Following Corll's death, Henley and Brooks led police to his house, and what they discovered revealed a true nightmare: a wooden torture board and other tools used for the horrific murders of at least 28 boys and men. Henley was given 6 life terms for his involvement, while Brooks received 1 life sentence. June 2, 1985. A routine shoplifting arrest in San Francisco cracked open one of the most gruesome crime sprees in California's history. Lake and Ning, both former Marines, shared a deeply twisted fantasy of enslaving women to satisfy their violent sexual desires. Obsessed with survivalism and fearing an imminent nuclear apocalypse, Lake had constructed a fallout bunker. But instead of preparing for doomsday, it became a dungeon for their captives. Between 1984 and 85, the pair lured potential victims to their remote cabin under the guise of offering work or friendship. The men were usually killed right away, while the women were held captive, tortured, and sexually assaulted. Actions the killers recorded on videotape. Among their victims were Harvey and Deborah Dubs, along with their son, as well as neighbors Lonnie Bond, Brenda O'Connor, and their son. In some cases, victims were forced to witness the assault and murder of their loved ones. One of the tapes, chillingly labeled M Ladies, captured Ning's cruel demeanor as he told victim Brenda O'Connor, "You can cry and stuff like the rest of them, but it won't do any good. We are pretty cold-hearted, so to speak." The killing spree came to an end when Ning was caught shoplifting. He managed to flee before police arrived, leaving Lake to deal with the situation, but authorities would soon unravel their dark secrets. Lake, initially trying to smooth things over with the police, was arrested when 4 officers found a gun with a silencer in his vehicle. While in custody, Lake swallowed a cyanide pill he had sewn into his clothing and died 4 days later. Even with Lake dead, The evidence spoke for itself. When police arrived at Leonard Lake's cabin near Wilsonville, they made a horrifying discovery: a hidden bunker where they found over 40 pounds of human remains, and where Lake and his accomplice, Charles Ning, had tortured, sexually assaulted, and killed at least 11 people. Investigators were stunned to find charred bone fragments, personal belongings of victims, and disturbing videotapes scattered throughout the property, which provided further overwhelming proof of their heinous acts. After the shoplifting incident, Ning managed to flee to Canada, but he was ultimately extradited to the U.S., where he was convicted in 1999 of 11 murders and sentenced to death. As of today, Ning remains on death row in California. March 22, 1999. Cynthia Vigil, battered and terrified, escaped from a trailer in Elephant Butte, New Mexico. Wearing only a dog collar and shackles, she ran for help, leading police to a disgusting crime scene. Inside, they found what David Parker Ray chillingly referred to as his toy box, a customized torture chamber where Ray and his accomplices had tortured, sexually assaulted, and murdered countless women. David Parker Ray, later dubbed the Toy Box Killer, had been terrorizing women for decades. Starting in the 1950s, he used drugs to induce memory loss in his victims, making it difficult for them to recall the horrors they endured. His girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, assisted in these gruesome acts, along with his daughter, Glenda, and a friend, Dennis Roy Yancey. Together, they tortured over 50 women, forcing them to call Ray master and recording many of the assaults on video. The toy box itself was a nightmare. At its center was a gynecological table, with mirrors above it so victims could see the torture being inflicted on them. On the walls we had surgical tools, saws, and sexual instruments neatly arranged, each with a specific sadistic purpose. Ray would even keep detailed diaries, documenting the torture and murder of his victims. Unfortunately, many bodies have never been recovered. According to Cindy Hendy, Ray's fatal victims were either buried or disposed of in nearby Elephant Butte Lake or remote ravines. By 1999, Ray's terror came to an end when Cynthia Vigil miraculously escaped after 3 long days of brutal captivity. She managed to remove her chains and run for help, leading police directly to Ray's trailer. David Parker Ray was given 224 years in prison. Although he agreed to help authorities locate the bodies of his victims, he never got the chance. May 2002, Ray died of a heart attack behind bars, leaving behind a trail of victims and many unanswered questions about how many women he truly murdered. Many of his victims still remain unidentified, and his legacy as one of America's most sadistic killers will never be forgotten. Still, it will indeed send shivers down your spine when you find out David Parker Ray wasn't the lone creator of a sinister movable torture chamber. February 1990. A couple were out hitchhiking when a semi-truck pulls over to offer them a ride. The driver, Robert Ben Rhodes, seemed like any other trucker, but what the couple didn't know was that this ride would be their last. Known as the Truck Stop Killer, Rhodes began his confirmed killing spree in 1990, although authorities suspect he had been active since 1975. Now, his first known victims were a newlywed couple, Patricia Walsh and Douglas Sikowski, whom he picked up while they were hitchhiking across Texas. Rhodes killed Sikowski quickly but kept Walsh captive for over a week, torturing and sexually assaulting her in his truck before ultimately killing her and dumping her body in Utah. Between the seats of his truck was a custom-built dungeon-like compartment. There, Rhodes restrained his victims with handcuffs attached to the ceiling, using tools from his murder kit: chains, cords, whips, fishhooks, and other sadistic devices. His next known victims were Regina K. Walters and her boyfriend, Ricky Lee Jones. As he had done before, Rhodes had killed Jones and kept Walters alive for several weeks, subjecting her to unimaginable torture. The most haunting evidence of this brutality came from a picture taken just before he killed Walters, a chilling image of the girl, head shaved and covered in bruises, staring fearfully into the camera. After weeks of torture, Rhodes killed Walters with garrote wire and discarded her body in a barn off Interstate 70 in Illinois. April 1990, Rhodes was finally arrested when an Arizona state trooper, Mike Miller, made a routine traffic stop on Interstate 10. The trooper noticed his semi-truck parked on the side of the highway with its hazard lights flashing. When Miller approached the truck to check on the situation, he found a visibly distressed and terrified young woman, naked and handcuffed inside the cab. The trooper immediately arrested Rhodes on suspicion of kidnapping, and as the investigation unfolded, authorities uncovered the extent of Rhodes' crimes. He was ultimately sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Regina K. Walters. 2012. He confessed to killing Patricia Walsh and Douglas Zukowski, though police believe his victim count could be as high as 50. After cross-referencing his trucking logs with missing persons reports, investigators suspected Rhodes killed at least 3 women per year over 15 years, turning his life on the road into a cross-country killing spree. Prosecutor Steve Smith said about Rhodes,
"He had an aura of pure evil. It was one of the rare times in my career when I could feel the hairs on my arm stand up in court just by being in the same room as him."
September 2011. The horrific discovery of a hidden underground dungeon in Luoyang, China, where 6 women were held captive by a former firefighter and a local government clerk for no less than 2 years, really shocked the world. 2009. Li Hao's secret life began when he purchased a residential property in Henan Province and built an underground lair. Over the next 2 years, he lured 6 women, mostly workers from karaoke bars and nightclubs, under the pretense of giving them money for services. Once they entered his compound, they were trapped. He subjected them to unspeakable abuse, filming them and selling that footage online to profit from their suffering. Li Hao's crimes extended beyond imprisonment and exploitation. He would force women to engage in online sexual activities for viewers, further dehumanizing them. And then tragically, 2 of his captives were murdered. One was beaten to death, and the other strangled by her fellow captives, following Li's orders. September 2011, the turning point came when one of the women managed to escape and contacted police. Her bravery led to the raid at Li's house, where authorities uncovered his dungeon. Inside, they found evidence of his heinous acts, including makeshift rooms where the women had been kept, along with harrowing footage of their exploitation. During his trial, Li Hao confessed to his crimes, admitting that his primary motivation was financial gain. He had spent months in the basement, telling his wife and kid, who were reportedly unaware of this secret life, that he was working night shifts. In 2012, he was sentenced to death for murder, rape, illegal detention, and exploitation. The court found him guilty of orchestrating a system of abuse that left deep psychological scars on his victims. 3 of the women, who had been coerced into participating in the deaths of their fellow captives, received leniency during sentencing due to the extreme conditions they'd been subjected to. January 2014, Li Hao was executed, bringing an end to one of China's most disturbing criminal cases. His underground dungeon was destroyed, but the trauma and devastation he left continue to haunt the lives of those affected. 1834. A fire breaks out at Delphine LaLaurie's mansion at 1140 Royal Street in New Orleans. When rescuers got there, they uncovered a scene far more horrifying than those flames. Stories had already spread about LaLaurie's cruelty, like the young girl who jumped off the roof to escape her. But what they uncovered, broken bones twisted into strange shapes and bodies wrapped in human intestines, revealed the sick horror she was really into. Known for her wealth and charm, LaLaurie was a prominent socialite, hosting elegant parties and mingling with the city's elite. 1771. She was just 4 years old when the Haitian Revolution began, a rebellion that terrified slaveholders across the southern U.S. and the Caribbean. And Delphine's family was no exception. Her uncle was killed by his slaves that same year. Many believe that these events shaped Delphine into the cold-blooded murderer she later became. And later on that fateful day, the fire would start in the kitchen, where a cook, chained to the stove, confessed to starting it in a desperate attempt to escape. And as firefighters continue to search the house, they discover a hidden attic, where 7 enslaved people were chained, beaten, and horrifically mutilated. Some had been held captive for months, suffering unimaginable torture. Witnesses have described this mansion as a nightmare hidden in plain sight, right in the heart of New Orleans. They also claim that they found people with broken bones, set in unnatural positions, holes in their skulls, and other shocking injuries. The atrocities were so severe that those rescued were barely alive, kept only to endure more torture. Before that fire, there were already whispers about LaLaurie's cruelty. An enslaved girl reportedly jumped to her death from the roof, choosing to end her life than face more torment. Another woman had her bones broken and reset to appear crab-like, and a third woman was wrapped in human intestines. However, when the truth came to light, LaLaurie fled the city, escaping to Paris, where her final fate is still unknown. Some say she lived out her days in hiding, but no one knows for sure. While in exile in Paris with her family, her son Paulin wrote that Delphine had seriously considered returning to New Orleans. However, the disapproval of her children stopped her from following through. The circumstances of her death are just as unclear. A story circulated that she died in a boar hunting accident, but records say she might have passed away in Paris on December 7, 1849, at the age of 62. And even though the original house was destroyed by a furious mob after the fire, the property was rebuilt and still stands today. Over the years, it's been used as everything from a school to a music conservatory. Despite its many transformations, the mansion's dark past continues to live on to this day. There are countless stories of ghostly encounters and strange happenings, with many believing the tortured souls of LaLaurie's victims still haunt the halls. June 7, 2002. Serial killer Maury Travis made a fatal mistake when he sent a taunting message to a local reporter, giving away too much. Investigators traced the tip back to him, leading to a raid on his house, and what they found inside his St. Louis, Missouri home was way too sick to even imagine. They uncovered the basement as a torture chamber where he would kill women, recording the horrific acts on videotape. Not only that, bloodstains, shackles, and plans to expand his dungeon revealed the true extent of his depravity. You see, Travis had fantasized about murder since his teenage years, starting off by killing small animals. By the early 2000s, he had upgraded to humans. He often cruised the Stroll, a known area for sex workers, luring women back to his house with promises of drugs, and once inside, he trapped them in their basement, where he tortured, sexually assaulted, and filmed their final moments. In one of these tapes, Travis could be heard coldly boasting about his first kill.
First kill was 19 years old. Name? I don't know. I don't give a fuck.
His sadistic rituals included forcing his victims to dance in white clothing or wear sunglasses while shackled to a wooden post. The videos were so bad that Police Chief Joe Mokwa ordered mandatory counseling for every detective who viewed that disturbing footage. October 2001, Travis would taunt a local reporter by sending a computer-generated map marking the location of a victim's body. Along with it, he had a letter in which he wrote, "I'll tell you where many others are, and to prove I'm real, here's directions to number 17. This was after a series of brutal murders between May and October 2001, when 4 women, Teresa Wilson, Verona Thompson, Yvonne Cruz, and Brenda Beasley, were tortured and shackled. After the St. Louis Post-Dispatch ran a profile piece on Wilson, Travis responded with an anonymous letter and map. Investigators traced the map back to Travis's computer and raided his home, uncovering blood from at least 6 victims and finding blueprints for expanding his basement into a more elaborate torture chamber. Before police could charge Travis with any of the murders, he chickened out and hanged himself in prison, taking with him many secrets about the true number of victims who suffered in his basement of horrors. November 2023. Egyptian authorities made a horrifying discovery near the city of Port Said. The body of a woman brutally tortured and murdered. Over the next 2 months, 3 more bodies were found in remote desert locations, all bearing the same grisly hallmarks of torture, sexual assault, and mutilation. The investigations led to a shocking suspect, Kareem Salim, a 37-year-old professor, former teacher, and popular TikTok influencer with over 600,000 followers.
Don't say thank you. Say, I appreciate it. Don't say you're welcome. Say, my pleasure.
1987, born in Alexandria, Salim grew up in a privileged family. On the surface, he seemed destined for success, earning a PhD in psychology in the U.S. before returning to Egypt in 2017 with his wife and son. But after his marriage had collapsed and his drug addiction spiraled out of control, Salim's behavior grew increasingly erratic and violent. His wife left him, and he took custody of their son, Gein. To his social media followers, Salim was a charismatic and cultured figure. He was known for his educational TikTok videos about American English and parenting, often featuring little Gein. But behind closed doors, he led a double life as a sadistic serial killer. In a specially soundproofed room in his luxurious New Cairo apartment, he tortured and murdered women, sometimes while his son was in the house. And after finding the 3 bodies, the police started investigating, thinking a serial killer was behind it. The breakthrough came in when they traced his rented SUV to the locations where the victims' bodies were dumped. This led to a raid on his apartment, where authorities uncovered a scene of unimaginable horror. Inside a soundproof room, they found chains, whips, electrical wires, and hidden cameras. They would also discover videos of Salim torturing and sexually assaulting his victims, many of whom can be seen begging for their lives as he mocked them. It was later revealed that he had been selling these gruesome videos on the dark web, profiting from his victims' suffering. And on May 20th, 2024, Salim was arrested in his New Cairo apartment. Initially, he claimed innocence, suggesting that a former lover had framed him. But when he saw the video evidence, he confessed. He said he would lure women through social media, drug them, and then subject them to unspeakable torture before killing them. Chillingly, he said he had no clear memory of how many women he had killed, but authorities suspect the real number could be close to 30. September 2024, after a swift trial, Kareem Salim was sentenced to death by hanging. May 1994. A police investigation at 25 Cromwell Street, Gloucester, unraveled one of the most shocking cases of sadistic murder in UK history. Rosemary West and her husband, Fred West, had been responsible for a series of gruesome murders spanning over 2 decades. The house was more than just their family home. It was a house of horrors. November 29, 1953, born in Devon, Rose grew up in a deeply troubled home. She was the 5th of 7 children, raised by an abusive father and mentally ill mother. Her father did sexually abuse her, further destroying her childhood and leaving deep scars. And by the time she was a teenager, Rose began to act out, molesting her younger brothers and harassing local boys. At 15, Rose met Fred West at a bus stop. Despite his unkempt appearance and criminal background, Fred quickly charmed her. They began a relationship, and Rose moved in with him, becoming a nanny to his children from a previous marriage. Now, soon after, Fred was sent to prison, leaving Rose, who was only 17 at the time, in charge of his children. During this time, his stepdaughter Charmaine disappeared, with Rose claiming Charmaine went to live with her mother. And guess what? Charmaine's mom, Rena, had also disappeared around that time. 1972, Fred and Rose got married, and after his release, the pair turned their home into a death trap. Together, they lured vulnerable women into their house and tortured them, and then they buried victims in their basement until it became too full, and then they had to bury them in their garden. They also inflicted unimaginable abuse on their own children. Fred sexually assaulted their daughters, while Rose engaged in sex work and involved their children in her twisted world. Their heinous crimes went undetected for years until their daughter Heather disappeared in 1987. Rose claimed Heather had left on her own, but Fred's dark jokes about her being under the patio raised suspicions. And when social workers heard these comments, they alerted the police. 1994, the police launched an investigation. They discovered the remains of Heather, along with 8 other women, including Fred's stepdaughter Charmaine and her mother Rena. Fred initially took responsibility for the murders, but when it became clear that Rose was just as involved, she was given life in prison in 1995. Fred, however, escaped justice by taking his own life while in jail. leaving behind a note referring to himself as Freddy, the mass murderer from Gloucester. January 1988. Dorothea Puente's charming facade crumbled when police investigating a missing persons case dug up 7 bodies in her Sacramento boarding house yard. Puente was that sweet, elderly landlady that was really hiding a deadly secret. She'd been quietly killing her vulnerable tenants for years while cashing their Social Security checks. January 9, 1929. Born in Redlands, California, Puente too had a troubled upbringing. Orphaned at 8 and raised in foster care, she drifted into a life of crime pretty early on. After several failed marriages, she set up a boarding house in Sacramento during the 1970s. Praised by social workers for taking in society's tough cases, the elderly, mentally ill, and disabled, Puente used her reputation to cover her complete lack of empathy. And by the 1980s, her greed completely took over. She drugged her tenants, stole their valuables, and eventually began poisoning and strangling them. And so her victims, mostly elderly and homeless individuals without close family, would suddenly disappear, with their bodies secretly buried in her yard. 1988, her scheme unraveled when Alvaro Montoya, a tenant with mental health issues, went missing. Puente calmly told the police that Montoya had gone on vacation and convinced her other tenants to corroborate her story. But one of her tenants secretly handed an officer a note, revealing that she's making me lie for her. With Puente's permission, police began digging up the yard, discovering body after body, and as they continued the search, Puente snuck out of the house and fled to LA, but she was recognized by a man in a bar and arrested within 5 days. Charged with 9 murders, Puente maintained her innocence throughout her trial. Prosecutors portrayed her as a cold, calculating killer who preyed on the weak, using sleeping pills to drug her victims before suffocating them, then burying them in her yard. 1993, she was convicted of 3 murders and sentenced to life in prison. Until her death from natural causes in 2011, Puente insisted she had done nothing wrong, claiming that she had taken good care of her tenants. However, her name remains synonymous with one of California's most disturbing cases of elder abuse and murder. October 29, 2009. Police enter the home of Anthony Sowell, a seemingly ordinary man, only to uncover that he was hiding something sinister in his crawl spaces, basement, and backyard. August 19, 1959. Anthony Sowell was born and would be a victim of a troubled household in East Cleveland, Ohio. Raised by a single mother alongside 6 siblings, Sowell endured and witnessed extensive abuse, which deeply scarred his early life. And after serving in the U.S. Marine Corps, where he earned multiple commendations, Sowell's life took a darker turn. In 1989, he was convicted of attempted rape after a woman escaped his house. He spent 15 years in prison and got out in 2005. From that point on, Sowell blended into his Cleveland neighborhood, earning a modest living by selling scrap metal. Now, during this time, his neighbors occasionally complained about a foul odor coming from his house. Yet he always told them it was the nearby sausage shop. But in September 2009, the truth finally came to light when Latundra Billups, one of Sowell's surviving victims, had escaped and reported to the police that he had attacked her. With a search warrant, they entered his house and found bodies in various parts of the property. The victims had all been strangled, and the conditions in which their bodies were found, some stuffed into crawl spaces, others buried in shallow backyard graves, really painted a gruesome picture of Sowell's brutality. As it turned out, he would lure vulnerable women, often struggling with addiction or homelessness, by giving them drugs and alcohol. And once inside, they were assaulted, killed, and hidden away like it was nothing. And as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Sowell had been living alongside his victims' decomposing bodies for years. 2011, Sowell was ultimately convicted of 11 counts of aggravated murder, along with dozens of other charges, including kidnapping and abuse of a corpse. The jury recommended the death penalty, and on August 12, 2011, he was sentenced to death. February 8, 2021, after years of appeals, Anthony Sowell died in prison from a terminal illness. never having faced execution for his heinous crimes. December 21st, 1978, when police entered John Wayne Gacy's house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue in Chicago, they uncovered a terrifying scene that shocked the nation: 29 hidden bodies within the property. March 17, 1942, born in Chicago, John Wayne Gacy also had a troubled upbringing, marked by an abusive father. Despite these challenges, Gacy appeared to lead a relatively normal life as an adult. He would work as a contractor, was very active in his community, and would even perform as Pogo the Clown at children's parties. Nobody could have known he was leading a sinister double life. Between 1972 and 76, Gacy would take at least 33 men and boys into his house under the pretense of offering them work or friendship. But once inside, he subjected them to unimaginable cruelty, eventually ending their lives. He buried 26 of his victims in the crawl space beneath his house, with others disposed of on his property and in the nearby Des Plaines River. His horrific acts went unnoticed for years until December 1978, when he became a suspect after the disappearance of Robert Piest. Following this lead, authorities searched his house, uncovering the most gruesome remains of multiple victims.
Supposedly went down in the crawl space, crawled around. There was no mounds of dirt, there was no odor, there was no nothing. I never feared anybody going down the crawl space.
Gacy was arrested and after confessing to the murders was convicted of killing 33 people. 1980, despite his attempt to plead insanity, he was sentenced to death. And although Gacy was executed on May 10, 1994, the investigation into his crimes continues. 5 of his victims remain unidentified, and authorities are still working to give them names and bring closure to their families. 1988, a quiet neighborhood in Kansas City was shaken to its core when a man escaped from the home of Robert Berdella, leaping from a second-story window while wearing nothing but a dog collar. January 31, 1949, born in Ohio. It also turns out Berdella had a troubled childhood. He would grow up isolated and frequently bullied due to his severe nearsightedness and speech impediment. His father was pretty abusive, and these early experiences of violence likely shaped his later sadistic behavior. After moving to Kansas City in the 1960s, Berdella's life took a dark turn. He opened an oddities shop called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar and began surrounding himself with vulnerable men, many of whom were runaways or involved in petty crime. 1984, Berdella committed his first murder. He abducted Gary Howell, he had known through multiple acquaintances, and subjected him to hours of torture before ultimately killing him. From there, Berdella's gruesome killing spree continued, luring several vulnerable young men to his house, drugging, torturing, and dismembering them over a span of 4 years. One of Berdella's preferred methods of torture involved shocking his victims with electricity, injecting chemicals into their bodies, and using various objects to inflict severe pain. Each act was carefully documented in a notebook, showing a disturbing level of detail and control.
The way I treated my victims, I treated them as something less than human. Nothing more than a play toy or a play object.
When police raided Berdella's home at 4315 Charlotte Street, they uncovered a place straight out of my nightmares. Inside a closet, they found human remains, including a skull and vertebrae that had been sawed apart. They would also find a human head buried in the backyard, while the basement was filled with blood-stained barrels and personal items belonging to missing men. And among the most chilling discoveries were the Polaroid photos of men being tortured and that meticulous journal detailing the brutal acts committed against the victims. After his arrest, Berdella avoided the death penalty by revealing details of his crimes in exchange for life in prison without parole. 1992, he would die in prison of a heart attack at the age of 43. 2002, a search of Robert William Pickton's pig farm in British Columbia revealed one of Canada's most terrifying discoveries. DNA from dozens of missing women were found on the property, confirming suspicions that had swirled for years. October 24, 1949, Pickton was born and grew up on a pig farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. His childhood was also marked by a harsh upbringing, with his father largely absent, leaving his eccentric and strict mother Louise to raise him and his brother. Now, Louise was a domineering figure, forcing the boys to work long hours on the farm, which left him ostracized at school due to their constant smell of manure and dead animals. Due to this, Pickton struggled academically and socially, eventually dropping out of school. One disturbing event from Pickton's early life didn't involve him directly, but it did leave a dark stain on his family's reputation. In 1967, his brother Dave accidentally struck a boy, Tim Barrett, with his truck. Instead of helping that boy, who was still alive, Louise pushed him into a nearby slough where he drowned. This cold act hinted at the lack of empathy that would define Pickton's gruesome crimes later on. Pickton began his killing spree in the early 1990s, preying on vulnerable women from Vancouver's downtown east side. His method of disposing his victims was pretty sick. He would either take their remains to a nearby meat rendering plant or just feed them to the pigs. He admitted this to an undercover cop while in holding after his arrest. "I find the best way to fucking dispose of something is fucking take it to the ocean." "Oh, really? I did better than that." February 2002, police raid his farm looking for illegal firearms, but stumble upon evidence linking him to the missing women. Further searches revealed the remains or DNA of at least 33 women on the property. Though Pickton was charged with only 26 counts of murder, he was actually convicted of only 6 in 2007, receiving the max sentence: life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. 2024, Pickton became eligible for day parole, sparking outrage across Canada. However, he never lived to see freedom because in May 2024, he was attacked by a fellow inmate, Martin Charest, who used a broken broom handle to spear Pickton in the head. Pickton was airlifted to a hospital, but succumbed to his injuries on May 31st, finally closing the chapter on one of Canada's most notorious serial killers, the Pig Farmer Killer. November 1985. Police in Malabar, Florida discovered a scene of unimaginable horror after a handcuffed Laura Murphy was found crawling along the road after she had escaped from a man later known as the Vampire Rapist. October 1st, 1946, born in Clarksburg, West Virginia, John Brennan Crutchley's childhood was marked by neglect and abuse. His mother, distraught over the loss of her first daughter, dressed him up as a girl for the first 6 years of his life and subjected him to severe physical abuse. And as he grew older, Crutchley developed an obsession with electronics, which led to a successful career in high-tech engineering. But despite his professional success, his personal life was a different story, marked by failed marriages and increasingly disturbing behavior. By 1985, Crutchley's descent into depravity had reached its peak in his kidnapping of Murphy. After picking her up while she was hitchhiking, Crutchley brought her to his house under the guise of retrieving something for work. Once inside, he attacked her, choked her unconscious, and strapped her to his kitchen counter. Over the next day, he sexually assaulted her and then stuck her with needles, extracting blood from her arm, which he ingested. He would film everything, with the aim of reliving it later on through the footage. Crutchley had drained a lot of blood from her body. She was barely alive. However, she managed to escape while Crutchley was away, which led to his eventual arrest. When police searched his house, they found stacks of credit cards, women's jewelry, locks of hair, and sexually explicit photos of bound women, suggesting that Murphy wasn't his only victim. Crutchley also kept a disturbing index of his sexual encounters, many of which crossed the line into assault. In exchange for avoiding a trial, Crutchley pled guilty to charges of kidnapping and assault, and he was ultimately sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Now, despite suspicions that he had killed as many as 30 women, no concrete evidence actually linked him to additional murders. In 1996, after serving only 11 years, Crutchley was released on parole. However, less than a day later, he was arrested again for violating parole by testing positive for marijuana. This resulted in his return to prison, where he remained until his death in 2002. Crutchley was found dead in his cell, the result of asphyxiation from a plastic bag, in what was later ruled an act of autoerotic asphyxiation. putting an end to the life of one of America's most disturbing criminals. July 1976, another horrifying discovery was made inside a shared toilet in Duisburg, West Germany, when a neighbor asked Joachim Kroll what had clogged the pipes, and he casually replies, "Guts." 1933, Kroll was born in Nazi-era Germany. He was the youngest of 8 children, growing up in a poverty-stricken World War II setting, and his childhood was pretty bleak, marked by humiliation and a lot of cruelty. He was a frequent bedwetter and displayed disturbing behavior toward animals, a common red flag for violent tendencies later on in life. In 1955, Kroll's crimes began with the murder of Irmgard Strell. He strangled her, sexually assaulted her lifeless body, and then mutilated it. But what set Kroll apart from many other killers was his cannibalism. He claimed that the high cost of meat led him to cut pieces of flesh from his victims, which he cooked and ate. Now, that depravity went undetected for years, with innocent men arrested for his crimes, some even committing suicide in despair. Kroll targeted women and girls, but his victims varied widely in age. His methods also differed. While some were cannibalized, others weren't, making it difficult for investigators to link the murders together. He would often lure his victims in isolated areas, and sometimes would even kill men, as in the case of Hermann Schmitz in 1965. So despite his growing body count, Kroll had evaded capture for decades. He seemed pretty indifferent to the terror he spread, until that day he finally faced justice. While the police were going door to door asking about a girl who had disappeared, one of Kroll's neighbors mentioned that the waste pipe in their building had been clogged. When he asked Kroll if he knew what was blocking it, Kroll casually replied, "Guts." So when police searched his apartment, they would find the dismembered remains of Marion Kettner, the very girl they were searching for. Her body parts were in his fridge, while a hand was found cooking on the stove. Kroll was arrested on the spot. He eventually confessed to 13 murders and admitted to cannibalism, believing that he could be cured through surgery. Instead, he was given life in prison in 1982, and then he died of a heart attack 9 years later. July 22, 1991, the day Jeffrey Dahmer's horrifying killing spree came to an end. Police entered his Milwaukee apartment, and they couldn't have imagined the gruesome scene awaiting them. Now, they were there because of Tracy Edwards, a man who had escaped from Dahmer just moments before, running down the street in handcuffs, desperate to survive. May 21, 1960, born in Milwaukee, Dahmer was a withdrawn child who loved collecting dead animals and really became obsessed with the idea of control. He celebrated his high school graduation in 1978 by killing someone, and from there, his urges spiraled out of control. Dahmer's fascination with death started pretty young, but it grew into something monstrous. Luring his victims with promises of money or companionship, Dahmer drugged them before killing and mutilating their bodies. And he wouldn't just dispose his victims, he preserved their parts. In some cases, he kept the skulls as trophies, and for others, he would eat parts of their bodies. His fascination with control led him to experiment with crude lobotomies, drilling into his victims' skulls in a twisted attempt to create zombie-like, submissive companions.
I had these obsessive desires and thoughts wanting to control them, to possess them permanently.
For years, Dahmer's atrocities went undetected, until Edwards' escape triggered the investigation that finally revealed his horrors. Inside his apartment at 924 North 25th Street, police found a nightmare. Pictures of dismembered bodies, human remains stuffed in the fridge, and heads stacked in the freezer were just the beginning. Bones, skulls, and a barrel filled with acid used for dissolving flesh painted a real terrifying picture of what had been happening in this unassuming home. Dahmer later admitted to committing 17 murders between 1978 and 91. In January 1992, Dahmer's trial began. Though his defense argued insanity, the jury found him mentally sane and guilty. He was given 15 consecutive life terms with no possibility of parole. But Dahmer's life behind bars was short-lived. On November 28, 1994, fellow inmate Christopher Scarver attacks Dahmer in the prison's bathroom, killing him. Scarver, who was also serving a sentence, attacked Dahmer while he was cleaning a staff locker room. According to him, as he was assaulting Dahmer, he didn't scream or make a sound. Scarver then calmly returned to his cell and informed a prison guard of what he had done.
God told me to do it. Jeffrey Dahmer's dead.
November 16, 1957. Police in Plainfield, Wisconsin entered Ed Gein's house after the disappearance of Bernice Warden, a local hardware store owner.
Saw this object that was hanging from the rafters, which at first they thought was some kind of gutted deer. They realized, to their incredible horror, that it was a woman's corpse that was hanging by its heels.
Born on August 27, 1906, Ed Gein would grow up under strict religious influence from his domineering mother, Augusta. She instilled in him a deep disdain for women, teaching him that they were vessels of sin. Not only that, but Ed would live a reclusive life on his family's farm, isolated from society, and entirely devoted to his mother. 1945, when Augusta died, Gein's mental state deteriorated further. Desperate to bring her back, he began visiting local graveyards, exhuming bodies that resembled her. Over the next decade, Gein's obsession escalated. He confessed to murdering 2 women, Bernice Warden and tavern keeper Mary Hogan, whose remains were found in his house. He would later admit to grave robbing, using body parts from deceased women to create his skin suit, a grotesque attempt to become his mother and fulfill his delusional fantasies of bringing her back to life. And as the years went by, what actually led up to his arrest? Well, a 16-year-old boy who used to hang out with Gein, watching baseball games and going to movies, told his parents something shocking about the man they considered a friend. Gein had shrunken heads in his house. Now, Gein claimed that they were souvenirs from a cousin who served in World War II. But when police checked it out, they found it was something far worse. Those relics were actually human facial skins, carefully peeled from corpses. Not only that, but in this dim light of Gein's dilapidated farmhouse, Warden's body was decapitated, hanging upside down from her ankles. Yet this was just the beginning of what became one of the most terrifying discoveries in criminal history. As officers combed through the house, they uncover a gruesome collection of human remains. Chairs upholstered in human skin, bowls made from skulls, and masks crafted from the faces of Gein's victims were just a few of the items found. Among this sick crap was a corset made from a female torso and a lampshade fashioned from a human face. Each item revealed Gein's twisted obsession with preserving and repurposing human bodies. Gein was arrested shortly after the discovery of Warden's body. This guy was charged with 2 murders, but authorities found over 40 victims in his house, many of whom were and used to create his ghastly collection. In 1957, Gein was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. This guy remained there for the rest of his life, dying in 1984 at the age of 77. And while his house mysteriously burnt down shortly after his arrest, the legacy of his crimes lived on, inspiring iconic horror film characters like Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill.